Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Can I provide a definition? No,
Yeah.
I can't.
What are women? You've probably seen this asked a lot lately. The deceptively simple phrase has triggered a cultural maelstrom that's swallowed entire countries by now. It seems like the people asking the question the most are, ironically, the ones who don't think it's up for debate.
How would you guys define a woman?
Actually tell me what a woman is.
You think that there are genetic or biological characteristics that define a woman?
A woman is a human being with two X chromosomes. Ask any geneticist.
Radical trans theory is effectively erasing the concept of womanhood.
And you know our culture is broken when saying who's a woman can't be spoken.
And it feels like defining woman should be a pretty trivial task. We're all familiar with women. We all associate certain things with being a woman. Roughly half of us are women and presumably call ourselves that for some good reason. But somehow, those of us who think a lot about gender tend to have the murkiest definitions. Progressives will often answer this question by saying, a woman is someone who identifies as a woman, basically sidestepping the issue at hand. This is the most tolerant approach because it lets people decide for themselves whether they're women, and I appreciate that. But the phrase is also a really easy target. You can't define woman has joined the pantheon of conservative owns, alongside triggered and it's ma'am. And I understand why. This definition of woman is circular and unhelpful. It does nothing to resolve the actual question people have, which is, what makes someone a woman? Why do trans women call themselves that, and why should I agree with them? I've said before that the online left puts too much stock in identities and labels, so as you can imagine, this very abstract, nebulous definition doesn't really satisfy me. But in my research for this video, reading dozens of different definitions, I found that actually none of them have. That every straightforward definition of woman has failed in some way. This question is far deeper, far more fraught than it first appears. I know the shadow of Marsha Blackburn, Tucker Carlson, and the entire United Kingdom will loom large over this video. The anti-trans movement is eager to find quotable figures they can prop up as everything that's wrong with society these days. And I realize that by making this video, I've made myself a likely target of that. But I'm here to dig deeper, not implicate myself in a culture war. If you think the matter is settled and only came here to hate watch, you're wasting your time. Go call your mom, go outside, I don't know, touch grass. So what are women, actually? What makes someone a woman? And finally, why does my hair look like that? I'm growing it out, okay? Give me a break. If we're going to come up with a complete answer to this question, we first need to understand how we got here. Despite what conservatives might have you believe, gender isn't a static thing. It varies hugely across time and across cultures. There is no gender without people. I'll start us off with some context on how modern womanhood emerged in my culture. I'm a white Canadian descended from British and French colonists. We'll get a different perspective in the next section, but European views on gender are important because colonization. Europe was a mistake. Anyway, asking this question now is fundamentally different than asking it 100 years ago. The difference in women's standing is stark and well known. Most women couldn't go to school, couldn't vote, couldn't own property, yada, yada, yada. You know all this. Because when we talk about women's history, this is usually where we start, around the turn of the 20th century. We talk about how bad things used to be and how much they've improved since. It's easy to take this 100-year slice of history and extrapolate that the further back you go, the worse things were for women. Often, we talk about the past as if these oppressive forces, like sexism, racism, homophobia, must have started off horrifically bad and then steadily improved over time. But we shouldn't assume these forces have always been around, because they aren't inherent to us, they're power structures. That means that at some point, sexism had to be invented. If you go way, way back in time, say 12,000 years before we'd really figured out agriculture, societies were probably pretty egalitarian, at least as far as gender goes. Gender roles did exist in most societies, but they're so different from the ones we know today that it's hard to identify with them at all. Ancient women might have spent their time foraging for food or milling grains, and neither of those are really gendered nowadays. There were expectations on women. There was such a thing as women's work, but it probably wouldn't have been devalued in the same way. There's no reason women would have been seen as inferior. It's tough to know for sure, since there's no written record from these cultures, but it seems like gender roles weren't all that oppressive. Women had all kinds of roles they could hold in their communities. When we talk about womanhood as if it's always been defined by pregnancy and motherhood, we make a mistake. Back in these days, motherhood, as we now know it, didn't exist. The nuclear family with the man, the woman, and the kids, they didn't have that yet. In ancient Eurasia, the basic social unit was a lot bigger. People had close bonds with their aunts and uncles, their cousins, and non-relatives in their communities. As a result, kids weren't just raised by one woman, but by several. A kid might have had 3 or 4 people in their life who they called mother, not just the one who gave birth to them. If any social structure is the default for humans, it might be this. These big, fluid, interdependent, egalitarian communities. Back in these days, cooperation was the norm. People struggled to stay warm and feed themselves, so there was no incentive for people to break off into smaller familial groups. As the years went on, we got better at not starving to death. We domesticated livestock, figured out farming, and moved away from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. This didn't happen at the exact same time in every European culture, but I'm going to talk like it did for the sake of conciseness. People have enough food to eat now. And in fact, some people have more than they need to survive. The surplus belonged to men by default since they were the farmers. Since communities all worked together to survive, this didn't have to be a big deal. But then the question of inheritance came up. When a man dies, who should get all his stuff? Typically, it would have gone to his mother's family. But the men of the day weren't thrilled with this arrangement. They had something else in mind. Somehow, probably with the threat of violence, men took over. They replaced the matrilineal system with a patrilineal one. Then they took it a step further and decided that actually men shouldn't just own the products of their labor, but of women's labor too. The men took private ownership of what was once the collective home, including the women and children inside it. It was the first form of the family to be based not on natural, but on economic conditions, on the victory of private property over primitive, natural, communal property. The Greeks themselves put the matter quite frankly. The sole exclusive aims of monogamous marriage were to make the man supreme in the family, and to propagate, as the future heirs to his wealth, children indisputably his own. Otherwise, marriage was a burden, a duty which had to be performed, whether one liked it or not, to gods, state, and one's ancestors. Men defined themselves as the owning class, and reduced women to a position of servitude, defined not on their own terms, but in relation to men. The second sex that exists only to fill in the gaps. The age of cooperation had ended. In an old, unpublished manuscript written by Marx and myself in 1846, I find the words, "The first division of labor is that between man and woman for the propagation of children." And today I can add, the first class opposition that appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage, and the first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male. The French feminist Monique Wittig said that this antagonism is still foundational to our gender binary today. In her essay collection, The Straight Mind, she compares gender relations to the relationship between a worker and their boss. Actually, she compares it to the relationship between a slave and their master. White feminists of the day loved calling themselves slaves, especially the rich academic ones. I don't want to do that. We're going to compare it to a workplace instead. Traditionally, the woman produces the household by birthing and raising the kids, but the man owns the household, the product of her labor. Neither gender exists without this relationship. You're not a boss unless you have power over an employee, just as some would say you're not a real man unless you have power over a woman. The opposite is also true. If you don't work for a boss, you're not an employee, you're just some person doing stuff. If you don't do as a man wishes, you're not a real woman. So that's how modern gender first started to take form. And again, this isn't what happened everywhere. It's what happened in European cultures that would later evolve into superpowers and colonize the world. But even this gender system is pretty rudimentary. It didn't have many of the pressures of modern womanhood because it predates capitalism and industry and borders. You can't be expected to shave your legs if razor blades don't exist yet, you know? So things didn't really kick into gear until when Europeans colonized the world, they forced people into the gender system we know today. It's built around a few core beliefs. Among them, women should be subservient to men, gender should decide what opportunities you have, and the nuclear family is natural and good. You've probably heard about indigenous cultures across the world that had, and in some cases still do have, less rigid gender systems. These weren't universal before colonization, but they were pretty common. The native author Paula Gunn wrote about some in her book, The Sacred Hoop: Recovering the Feminine in American Indian Traditions. In considering gender-based roles, we must remember that while the roles themselves were fixed in most archaic American cultures, with divisions of women's work and men's work, the individuals fit into these roles on the basis of proclivity, inclination, and temperament. As an example, the Kaska of Canada would designate a daughter in a family that had only daughters as a boy. When she was small, around 5, her parents would tie a pouch of dried bear ovaries to her belt. She would dress in male clothing and would function in the Kaska male role for the rest of her life. The Yuma had a tradition of gender designation based on dreams. A female who dreamed of weapons became a male for all practical purposes. A lot of these cultures were more egalitarian and didn't see women as inferior. Allen points to the Cherokee bands in what's now the southeast US, who governed with a series of community councils, including highly influential women's councils. Even 500 or 600 years ago, politics weren't a man's game. As the British started taking over Cherokee land, they saw a vulnerability here. They realized that if they took power away from Cherokee women, they could disrupt the balance of the entire society. So, redefining womanhood became an essential part of British colonial strategy. According to the Sacred Hoop, they did this in 4 steps. 1. Replace their female creator figures with male ones, either by gender swapping their existing figures or shoehorning new male ones into their stories. 2. Refuse to recognize tribal governments until they institute Western democracy. Since only men could be elected in Western democracies, this meant replacing appointed female leaders with quote-unquote democratically elected male ones. 3. Economically devastate tribes by forcing them off their lands and making their traditional ways of life impossible. Make them depend on white institutions that can then demand they introduce patriarchy or perish. 4. Destroy the clan structure by killing off elders with famine and disease and forcibly assimilating youth. Replace the egalitarian clan with the male-dominated nuclear family. Our modern ideas about sex and gender aren't just a byproduct of colonialism, they're a tool of colonialism. When we talk about the gender binary as some fundamental truth of the universe, non-ideological and totally above reproach, we erase the countless cultures with more equal systems our governments have spent centuries trying to destroy. But Europeans didn't just impose their existing beliefs onto the world. The Argentine feminist Maria Lugones argued that Europeans changed their own gender system too, in fact pretty radically, to suit this new goal of world domination. Before colonization, European powers might have believed that a woman's place was in the home. But up to that point, the women they were dealing with were white European women. This idea was totally incompatible with their colonial ambitions. They absolutely did not want colonized women to stay in the home. That would mean losing half of their workforce. According to Lugones, Europe basically created a whole new gender out of thin air to sort these women into. Historically, the characterization of white European women as fragile and sexually passive opposed them to non-white colonized women, including female slaves, who were characterized along a gamut of sexual aggression and perversion, and as strong enough to do any sort of labor. For example, slave women performing backbreaking work in the US South were not considered fragile or weak. This is still true today. When the powers that be say that women belong at home with their kids, they aren't actually talking about most women. They think that most women belong in the fruit field or the garment factory or in prison. Not only do our economies demand this, our gender system does. Those women's labor is used to make rich white women look more womanly, more delicate in contrast. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Modern gender demands an underclass. Whether that's poor women whose dirty hands make theirs look cleaner, or trans women whose medicalized bodies make theirs look more natural. Creating an underclass is why it exists. That's what it's for. Our gender system gives a lot of power to men, obviously, but also to the wealthy and to the dominant culture. As a member of that dominant culture, I should mention that this mostly benefits me. Even as it's been traumatic in some ways, it's the reason I live in a rich country with cheap clothes and fresh produce from all around the world. So as much as this video is going to be about transphobia, because that's what I'm qualified to speak on, let's keep in mind that white trans people aren't remotely the main victims of this gender system. So the modern category of womanhood wasn't invented with our best interests in mind. The womanhood we know today started as a tool to erase cultures, exploit labor, and steal property. This has harmed all women deeply, even the ones it was designed to privilege. The most basic goal of feminism is to repair some of this harm, to level the playing field and create a better world for women. Across the wide spectrum of tendencies, just about all feminists think they're doing this. But as I'm sure you know, our actual strategies for doing this are all over the place and frequently contradict each other. Some self-professed feminists want to criminalize sex work and keep teenagers off hormone therapy, and I think that's straight up evil. I want nothing to do with that. So while all feminists are fighting to build a better world for women, that doesn't mean we're all fighting for the same thing. The ambiguity of the term feminist sums up the whole situation. What does feminist mean? Feminist is formed with the word femme, woman, and means someone who fights for women. For many of us, it means someone who fights for women as a class and for the disappearance of this class. For many others, it means someone who fights for woman and her defense, for the myth, then, and its reinforcement. A lot of this comes down to a split on a pretty important question. Is the colonial gender system with the nuclear family and the gender binary, is it reformable? Is it fundamentally broken, or can we patch it up and move on? Most feminists in the center and right seem to think we can. For example, your girl boss types, who want to reform gender a little bit for rich women while ignoring everyone else it hurts. Your turfy types actually want gender roles to be more restrictive and for the gulf between men and women to be even wider, because to them, only that can protect women. Feminists in these two tendencies usually defend the legitimacy of traditional binary womanhood because they think our social order would crumble without it. And to be fair, they're right. Without colonial gender, our modern world would be unrecognizable. But on the left, we tend to think that the social order is bad. If the left doesn't care to define woman, this is why. We're less attached to gender as it currently exists, as a restrictive box and a tool for domination. We do still like to ask the question, though. It's a good jumping off point for other, deeper conversations. It's provocative and eye-catching. I mean, you clicked on this video probably expecting a quippy takedown of TERFs or a satisfying answer to the question, and we might get there, but in the meantime, I've given you Gender Marxism 101. I think that's why some left-wing feminist definitions of woman appear to be kind of nonsense. They don't take the question too seriously. In The Straight Mind, Monique Wittig makes the bold claim that lesbians aren't women. And for what it's worth, she makes a strong case for it. She reminds us that nowadays women are defined in relation to men, as marrying them and having their kids. From here, it follows that if a woman has no relation to men, then there's nothing there to make her a woman. And to be clear, she thought this was a good thing. She didn't want to be a woman. Wittig had no interest in reforming womanhood and offering up some new progressive definition, because to her, there's nothing to reform. To her, gender distinctions and sex distinctions will always be oppressive. I don't know if I agree, but I'm glad I read the book. Then you've got something like Andrea Longchu's Females, which argues presumably something. I have a hard time telling what she's trying to say. Let me just read you some of the intro. Everyone is female. The worst books are all by females. All the great art heists of the past 300 years were pulled off by a female, working solo or with other females. There are no good female poets simply because there are no good poets. A list of things invented by females would include airplanes, telephones, the smallpox vaccine, ghosting, ink, envy, rum, prom, Spain, She keeps going like this for a while. I get the sense she likes the sound of her own voice. Let me just skip ahead to the end. I am female, and you, dear reader, you are female, even, especially if you are not a woman. Welcome. Sorry. This book is controversial, and I don't know if anyone's really figured it out. The most charitable read I can manage is that it's a sarcastic send-up of Monique Wittig's idea that womanhood is defined by repression. But instead of offering a counterpoint, Chu takes that idea to its logical extreme. She points out that actually everyone is repressed, so it would logically follow that everyone is a woman. But who knows if that's what she actually meant. But it got people talking, and for what it's worth, I definitely bought the book. So are lesbians not women? Or is literally everyone female? Maybe, but in my opinion, it hardly matters. In both cases, these really extreme definitions of woman or female were used as hooks to start some deeper conversations and get us all thinking about the lines we draw. As queer people and as women and as feminists, we don't have any reason to enforce gender or dictate who can call themselves what. If our modern genders exist to control us, maybe the only noble move is to disengage, not play the game, to avoid projecting our worldview onto other people. That circular definition we hear so often. A woman is someone who identifies as a woman. It's unsatisfying, sure, but to be fair, it does achieve this goal. Living by this definition frees us from the burden of gender policing. It means being tolerant and trusting that people act in good faith. If someone tells you they're a woman, there's almost never a reason to doubt them. Taking people's word for it is usually pretty harmless. This approach reflects the kind of world I want us to build. In contrast, the anti-trans movement is actually very interested in defining woman. They argue that if we don't have a clear-cut definition, we'll never be able to defend women's rights. This is an interesting take, because feminists have been working with competing definitions since at least the 1940s, and it's never stopped us before. Historically, the push to define woman has instead been pretty anti-feminist. It's usually done to make gender roles seem predestined. If your culture defines womanhood as motherhood, then it follows that all women must be mothers.
Women are built differently because their bodies are designed to do different things. Nature is real.
And from there you can claim that having kids isn't a social pressure, it's just literally what it means to be a woman. The whole point is to limit our possibilities. So if a rigid view of gender would hurt cis women, why are TERFs so dead set on one? Well, they seem anxious that if our definition of woman includes trans women, something bad will happen. Exactly what depends who you ask. It could be the corruption of young minds, or the shaming of lesbians, or the ruin of all those women's sports leagues we definitely cared about before. The idea is that by defining the word in a way that excludes us, they can separate us from cis women and keep them safe. The definition they're pushing hard these days, the one they hope will sell the public on trans exclusion, you've probably heard it before. It's 3 words we all know. Adult human female. To be a woman, you must be 1, not a child, 2, a human being, and 3, female. I feel like I should pause here and say that while this sequence of words sounds sensible if you look at their literal meaning, the anti-trans movement uses this definition not because of what's outwardly stated, but because of what's implied. that trans women are not female and therefore are not women. Not everyone who uses a definition like this is a bigot, because not everyone interprets this as explicitly trans-exclusionary. I've heard it said that this is the perfect definition because it doesn't rely on any outside variables, nothing to do with culture or a relationship to men or anything else that can fluctuate over time. It treats womanhood not as a cultural invention, but as an objective category. A woman is anyone who's an adult, a human, and female. This is so simple that anyone who disagrees with it looks ridiculous. There's no ideology here, just plain and simple truth. Except here's the thing. This is fucking nonsense. There is nothing simple about that definition because all three of those words are categories we made up. Adult, human, female resolves one semantic question by raising three more. 1. What are adults? The line between childhood and adulthood can be drawn in a million ways, and our common cutoff of 18 is totally arbitrary. If we go by biological maturity, your body keeps changing for your whole life, and your brain keeps developing until at least age 25. If we go by reproductive maturity, a 14-year-old can be an adult. That's horrifying. No thank you. 2, who is human? This sounds pretty straightforward until you consider that dehumanization has been an integral part of colonial strategy. The dehumanization of Black and Indigenous women has gone hand in hand with a degendering. You can bet if the powers that be don't see someone as human, they won't see them as a proper woman either. Our culture treats many women as animals or machines or just bodies. So any moves to protect women under this definition will, at best, ignore those women and, at worst, target them as deviant. 3, who is female? This is basically the question we started with, and every bit as obscure. Saying a woman is someone who's female is just as circular as saying a woman is someone who identifies as a woman. There are a million ways to define sex, and transphobes cycle through them endlessly, swapping out their definition however necessary to call trans women male in a given conversation. I have a whole video about this, about transphobes' shaky understanding of biological sex, so check that out if you want to hear more. Okay, enough about adult human females. That was fun, but owning TERFs with facts and logic can only get you so far. I hope I've made it clear that this definition falls apart with any amount of critical thinking, but at the same time, yeah, dude, it's a thought-terminating cliche. Avoiding critical thinking is the whole point. A lot of anti-trans rhetoric spreads like this, in these neat little phrases that feel intuitively true to most people, and it's no wonder they do. Adult human female is the definition we're taught by our parents and elementary school teachers before we can really think critically about these things. We have to keep in mind that TERFs are, at best, trying to entrench the status quo. At its core, this definition is anti-intellectual. It's used to say, whatever I've always believed is objectively true, and looking into it any deeper would be a waste of time. And that's empowering. It makes people feel like their intuition is uniquely in touch with reality, and that the truth is actually far simpler than some people have been saying. It's short, quippy, and wrong, and that makes it excellent culture war fodder. At this point, the trans community can retort with a detailed correction. Gender is complicated, here's a 12,000-year history lesson, but that's nowhere near as sticky. Challenging transphobes in the marketplace of ideas. At this point, someone started a generator next door, and it was so distracting that I paused filming and forgot to finish the sentence. What I was gonna say is, challenging transphobes in the marketplace of ideas will remain a losing game because they have the status quo on their side. A lot of regular, perfectly nice people conceive of women as adult human females, but in a way that's compatible with trans people existing. They might think we're the exception to the rule. And from this position, in a kind of ad hoc limbo, convincing them that trans people aren't an exception, that there are in fact no exceptions, is a far easier task than convincing them gender and sex are both fluid and socially constructed. There's just so much more to that idea. Okay, back to it. I realize this video is basically a long series of detailed corrections, and I feel okay about doing that because I don't make videos for conservatives trying to win them over. I make videos for people who already support trans rights and want to build more rigorous politics around that. It's not like every time some troll asks you to define woman, you're going to send them this video. Although I do hope you send them this video. Please share this video. My point is that TERFs like traditional gender for the same reason that conservatives do. They think it's a solid foundation for society and a good way to sort people. And they want to use it in the same way it's always been used, as a tool of domination, as a way to lift themselves up by forcing us down. Selling the general public on their definition would put a lot of power in their hands. Since our society is organized around the gender binary, revoking someone's access to womanhood means revoking their right to participate in mainstream society, in sports, sure, but also in good careers and healthcare and in socially acceptable relationships. Above anything else, that's their goal. To revoke our womanhood, push us out of the public eye, and morally mandate us out of existence. If the increase in gender policing hurts cis women too, which it does, that's just the cost of doing business. The anti-trans movement doesn't fight to protect women, the people, the individuals. Instead, they fight to protect women, the idea, the category. They fight to protect adult human females, the myth and its reinforcement. Okay, so now you know how modern gender emerged and why. You know why the left doesn't rigidly define gender and why the right does. But you haven't really heard what I think. So how do I define woman? Well, I think a useful definition of any word is descriptive. It should describe how a word is used in real life without necessarily endorsing that usage. If we're coming at this with descriptiveness in mind, our definition of woman should be based on how people already use the word. We should look at who calls themselves a woman, who's treated as a woman, and what people mean to evoke when they say the word woman. The tricky thing about defining woman is, at this point in the culture war, no one wants to do it this way. Feminists don't want to do this. Reactionaries don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. I want the dictionary to say I'm right and my opponents are wrong. And that's just not what the dictionary is for, really. That's why I doubt we'll ever reach a consensus on what women are. This is a really political question, now more than ever, and people ask it to further their political ends. Every simple definition I've heard offered up is at least a little prescriptive. It prescribes what the speaker wants women to mean, whether or not it does right now. It prescribes how the speaker wants women to think of themselves. That means that every simple definition leaves some women out. When TERFs say it means adult human female, the implication being that trans women are male, they're prescribing that trans women aren't women, even though we often move through the world as women. When progressives say it means someone who identifies as a woman, we exclude women who don't have strong gender feelings either way. I've met tons of them, cis and trans. It's impossible to come up with a simple, across-the-board definition without excluding some women and including some people who aren't women. Because these boxes are imaginary. We made them up, unleashed them on the world, and then we've spent the past century trying to reverse engineer them into something more palatable. In that process, our ideas have diverged. We've come to all sorts of different conclusions about what it means to be a woman. As a result, womanhood is defined a little bit by dozens of things, but not any one of them alone. In philosophy, this kind of grouping is called the family resemblance concept. The factors in your gender might include your sex, your identity, your name, your pronouns, your politics, what you wear, where you live, and probably a million other things I can't think of. This means that two people can be women for entirely separate and non-overlapping reasons. This actually reminds me of a conversation I had at this party ages ago at this point. I was 16, I want to say. I was dressing pretty femme, but I hadn't really transitioned. I was mostly still in the closet at this point. The party was really loud and I didn't know any people there, so I was keeping a low profile, hanging out on the couch, when suddenly this girl sits herself down next to me, very clearly not sober. She leans in close and she goes, "I have a question. Are you gay or something?" Now, I got this question all the time, so I was used to fielding it. Up to that point, my go-to answer was, "I have a girlfriend. Obviously, a boy with a girlfriend isn't gay." That wasn't going to work this time for two reasons. One, it was obvious by that point that the girlfriend in question was not a girl. And two, we had just broken up. So my defenses were down and I was totally on the spot. I decided to just tell this girl the truth. Actually, I dress like this because I'm trans. She didn't say anything, and I watched the cogs turn in her head for a second. And then she asked me something along the lines of, how's that work? So I told her, well, I don't feel like a boy. I feel like my gender's closer to girl. She didn't get it. She just asked, what's that mean? Oh boy, where do you even start with that? I figure, okay, buckle up. We're explaining gender in this very loud room on this very sticky couch. So I lean in close and I ask her, so you identify as a girl, right? I mean, what makes you a girl? She gave me a blank stare back and replied, well, I'm a girl because I have a vag. Oh boy, I had no idea what to say to this. Because, yeah, fair enough, dude. Maybe you are a girl because you have a vag. Maybe that's the extent of it for you. Who am I to tell someone they're wrong about themselves, you know? This was the moment I realized, not only do most people not understand gender, I don't understand gender. I don't know why some people are women and others aren't. I might be a woman for a completely different reason as someone else. That doesn't make either of us wrong. I love women in every way I know how to love. I admire them, I confide in them, I desire them, I support them. But the gender that unites us is fucking incoherent. It means so many different things to so many different people that it might as well not mean anything at all. But I think that diversity, that divergence of experience is a strength. I don't want to be a part of a movement where everyone is the exact same. I hope what I'm about to say isn't unsatisfying, but you've sat here listening to me for a solid half hour, so I think I owe you my honest opinion. No one can tell you what a woman is. In fact, it's barely a useful line of inquiry. The issue has been foregrounded for one reason: to control women, to limit how we view ourselves, what we can do, and who we can be. The defined woman crowd, they don't wish you well, even if you do fit their definition. Where we go from here, I'm not too sure. It's up to each of us to decide whether we can salvage any scraps of true, untainted gender from this sexist colonial wreckage. Maybe one day we'll decide once and for all what exactly unites us. Maybe womanhood will be about a connection to something deep and primal. Maybe we'll find purpose in picking mushrooms off tree trunks in the climate wasteland. Maybe the fuckers will win and women will be reduced to breeding stock. But probably none of these things will happen. Probably we'll keep disagreeing on this until the end of time. I think that's for the best. Having looked at this from all sides, I don't feel good about taking any hardline position. I don't want to tell women who they are or why. That feels kind of violent to me, and I don't think there's a way to go about it correctly. The whole exercise leaves a bad taste in my mouth. So I think I'm just gonna walk away. Maybe call my mom, go for a walk, touch grass, you know? I might spend some time reflecting on what connects me to the women in my life. I've been feeling pretty isolated this year. I think most of us have. And it's easy to forget that these people we're talking about are actual human beings and not just abstract ideas. Women come by after work for a drink. They smile as I pass them on the street. They cut in front of me at checkout. They lend me $50 when I'm running low. They leave anonymous comments trying to ruin my day. I don't care what they have in common. All I know is they deserve better. We all do. It's no secret that conversations like this can get a little heated, shall we say, especially online. It feels sometimes like only the loudest, angriest voices in a conversation get noticed. And if you don't want to play the outrage game, it can be hard to be heard. That's why I'm proud to be a part of the team building Nebula. Nebula is an award-winning, creator-owned streaming service that's home to the most thoughtful videos around. It's got creators like me, obviously, but also Jessie Gender, FD Signifier, Jacob Geller. Basically all the channels I watch are on there now. Nebula is 100% ad-free, and it's curated instead of relying on recommendation algorithms, which means the content is a lot more helpful and a lot less knee-jerky than you might find elsewhere. You can bet just about anything on there will be a good watch. I've had a membership almost 3 years now, way longer than I've been a professional YouTuber for. It's like the rare corner of the internet that's not trying to make you angry all the time. And I'm so grateful for that right now. We're also building up a pretty impressive library of exclusives, if I do say so myself. I just watched the Nebula original documentary Making Philosophy Tube, which was lovely and a really cool look inside the creative process. For fans of my channel, we've got a special offer going. If you follow my link in the description, you can get a year of Nebula for free when you sign up for Curiosity Stream. Curiosity Stream, of course, is the documentary streaming service with an honestly staggering amount of cool stuff. Their library has thousands of documentaries and miniseries about basically everything. You want to learn about astronomy, they've got that. You want to learn about chocolate, they got that too. Or do you want to just kick back, spend an hour hanging out with some cool birds? Curiosity Stream has you covered. With my link, you can get a year of Curiosity Stream and Nebula for less than 15 bucks. Why not give it a shot, you know? Head to curiositystream.com/LilyAlexander, sign up for Curiosity Stream and get a year of Nebula free, get ad-free access to my videos and thousands of others, and support indie creators like me while you're at it. I'll see you there. Well, folks, thanks for sticking it through to the end of the video. I hope your week's going well. I hope you're as relieved as I am that winter's ending. I want to thank my patrons for helping make this possible. Patrons get early access to all my uploads and a bunch of exclusive bonus videos that aren't anywhere else. I hear the parasocial thing works really well for this. If you join my Patreon, we're friends. And I especially want to thank those at the $6 and $12 tier, including Mid-Tier Art, Caitlin, Conna Q, Lee Sloth Pope, Samari Brayley, Erica Peterson, Taylor Hardy, Celeste Blossom, Izzy, Rosedale, Cersei Quake, Jasperry Wertanen, Ruby Landau Pincus, Detective Meow Meow, Emma Casley, Margot Boivin, Imogen Campbell, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Ivy, Lillian Revel, Cherie Mongiovi, Fly Girl, Sasha Karbaczynski, Gwen Loftman, Ren, Jane Malcolm, Maddie Mamode, Kieran McMullen, Pokey Cannon, Clara Griffin, Guillaume, Emily Martins, Alejandro Hernandez, Mathilde, Vivi, Pascal, Hannah Leichnitz, Tracy Renan-Tell, Kiki, Mariah, Luna Jade, Madeline Mausoleum, Charlie H., Transfemme Flim Flam, that one's a real mouthful, Autogyne Amelia, Quillworth, Katrina is a Human, The Numeral One, Cassie, Hot Girls Read Lennon, Jean, Mary Wishart, Kate Chappell, Jessie Earle, Rebecca Gale, Ricka Coy, Jessie Kemkis, Duck Grows Chilies, Linda Jewers, Fox Auslander, Wimblelimble, Smaz Ruby, The Recognition Scene, Sandy Smith, Blueberry Hill, Sam Dunscombe, Darla Butler, Scott Sometimes Lucy, Chloe Jane, Henry Rachutin, Dan Lizotte, Scatterflower, Megahertz, and finally, Yuna. Thank you all so much. Take it easy. Is it even possible to take it easy anymore? I'm not sure if I know how to do that.